Yesterday we started things off on this topic, and today we're back to finish it. In case you missed it, yesterday I posted a video where I began going through every team in the NBA, identifying the biggest mistakes that they made over the course of the 2022 season, as no team is ever perfect, and in hindsight, we can always pick out a few things that could have been handled differently. Last video, we went through the biggest mistake made by every team in the Eastern Conference, so today we'll be finishing things up by going through the teams in the Western Conference, and if you happened to miss yesterday's video, be sure to go watch that after you finish this one. Before we start though, I want to thank PrizePicks for sponsoring this video. PrizePicks is the perfect service for all of us basketball fans here because when you're involved, it makes watching the games every night so much more fun and engaging. Basically, it's an application that provides you with lines on all kinds of individual player props, such as points, rebounds, assists, three-pointers made, amongst others, and you simply have to choose whether you believe they will record over the set amount in the line or under the set amount in the line. Make your selections, wager however much you want to, and if your picks hit, you can win some big money. For some picks that I'm looking at making for tomorrow's NBA Finals game, I'm thinking of going with Marcus Smart to score under 14.5 points, Jordan Poole to make over 1.5 threes, and Jason Tatum to get over 6.5 rebounds. If this sounds at all intriguing to you, then go use the link down in the description of the video to sign up today and use promo code REFERENCE to receive a 100% deposit match bonus up to $100. Once again, thank you to PrizePicks for sponsoring this video. Now let's get back to the topic at hand. Going in alphabetical order, we're starting off with the Dallas Mavericks, and their biggest regret of the year is undervaluing Jalen Brunson. At one point, the Mavericks were ready to offer Brunson a contract extension worth around $55 million over the span of 4 years, and Brunson likely would have accepted it, but they pulled back the offer to see how the season would play out. Well, now Brunson is about to enter the offseason as one of the hottest commodities available in free agency, and will definitely be commanding a contract north of $20 million per year, so obviously the Mavs are kicking themselves for revoking that other offer now that his value has skyrocketed. Next up is the Denver Nuggets, and their biggest regret is giving Michael Porter Jr. a max contract extension. Even prior to his injury, Porter Jr. was improving nicely as a young player, but he still wasn't all-star caliber at the time, and yet the Nuggets paid him as if he was. On top of that, the injury concerns with him and his back have been there since he got drafted, so the combination of overpaying him and his worrying health status makes this one of the biggest whiffs of the year. Up next, we have the Golden State Warriors, and their biggest regret is not trading James Wiseman when they could. The Warriors' plan was always to get back to competing for championships when they drafted Wiseman second overall 2 years ago, and the thought by many has been that they would use him as a trade chip. They haven't gotten much return on the investment from him in terms of his play yet because of injuries, and if these issues continue to plague him moving forward, then they will have missed their opportunity to use him to acquire a piece that could help them win now on their current timeline. Next up is the Houston Rockets, and their biggest regret is waiting too long to entrust Jalen Green in the offense. In the first half of the season, the Rockets were playing an odd style for a rebuilding team. Sure, Jalen Green wasn't playing exceptionally well early on by any means, but he was also not being given much of a green light. The Rockets were still weirdly prioritizing veterans like Christian Wood and Eric Gordon offensively, and even Kevin Porter Jr. was being used more, but once they came to their senses and started allowing Green to play freely in the second half of the year, he started to explode, scoring an efficient 22 points per game over the span of his last 25 games played, and he even scored 30 or more points in 6 of his last 7 games, which shows what trust can do for a young player's confidence. Up next is the Los Angeles Clippers, and their biggest regret is undervaluing the point guard position. Point guard has consistently been a weak spot for the Clippers over the last few seasons, and after a hot streak by Reggie Jackson in last year's playoffs, they put way too much trust in him to carry the load this year. The other point guards that they came into the season with were Eric Bledsoe, who had been declining hard, along with second-round pick Jason Preston, and when Reggie Jackson's shooting fell off a cliff, the position was very weak for them throughout. Next up is the Los Angeles Lakers, and their biggest regret is trading for Russell Westbrook. Last summer, the Lakers reportedly had a few options available to them on the trade market, and now in hindsight, they probably made the worst choice. They could have traded for shooter Buddy Hield, they also could have acquired DeMar DeRozan before he went to the Chicago Bulls, but instead, they chose to get Russell Westbrook, and that move has proven to be a disaster. Up next, we have the Memphis Grizzlies, and their biggest regret is underrating themselves before the year began. Before the season started, nobody expected the Grizzlies to be as good as they were, and the Grizzlies themselves are apparently included in that group. Every move they made, from the trades they made to the way that they drafted, was under the impression that they were still in rebuild mode. But then the game started and they wound up as one of the best teams in the West, so if they had made a few more aggressive moves beforehand, they may have been able to push through the playoffs even further. Next up is the Minnesota Timberwolves, and their biggest regret is their playoff crunch time performances. It's funny that I just finished discussing how the Grizzlies outperformed all expectations, but had the Timberwolves not completely imploded time and time again against them in that first round series that they played against them, they very reasonably could have won that series. The Timberwolves mostly dominated the series, but they blew countless 20-plus point leads, and in that time, countless questionable decisions and play calls were made. Up next is the New Orleans Pelicans, and their biggest regret is how they handled Zion Williamson. Throughout Zion's entire tenure with the Pelicans, there has been friction between him and the organization, and this year it reached new heights. Zion suffered an injury before the year that was supposed to only hold him out of about a month of play, but he wound up missing the entire season, and while both sides carry an equal share of the blame, the entire situation was just a mess. Next up is the Oklahoma City Thunder, and their biggest regret is holding on to Kenrich Williams at the trade deadline. Williams proved to be a pretty valuable 3-and-D player this year that several contenders were inquiring about trading for, but the Thunder did not take any of those offers as the deadline expired. The Thunder could easily have acquired more draft capital, or even some other assets in exchange for him, but oddly they chose not to. Up next is the Phoenix Suns, and their biggest regret is not finding another shot creator to add to their rotation. The Suns were a well-oiled machine that ran through teams in the regular season, but playoff basketball always proves to be a different beast for teams who rely too hard on systems to create their offense. Cameron Payne's sharp decline this season really hurt them, because his ability to create off the bench was key to their success last year, and with Chris Paul's shortcomings, too much of the workload ended up being on Devin Booker's shoulders, and they lost in the second round. Next up is the Portland Trail Blazers, and their biggest regret is actually both of the trades that they made at the trade deadline. I was going back and forth on which of the trades would be my choice here, but couldn't settle on one, so I just included both of them. I really don't know what their thinking was, because they gave away CJ McCollum to the Pelicans for a deal that brought in much less than most expected they could get for him. Then they gave Norman Powell and Robert Covington to the Clippers for minimal return as well, so it just wasn't a good period. Up next is the Sacramento Kings, and their biggest mistake was the Tyrese Haliburton trade. The Kings just can't stop shooting themselves in the foot, it seems. Tyrese Haliburton was emerging as one of the best young guards in the NBA this year, and in a head-scratching move, attempting to win now, they traded him for Domantas Sabonis to the Pacers. It's nothing against Sabonis, but he didn't really make the team any better at all, and now the Pacers have the perfect young player to shape their rebuild around. Next up is the San Antonio Spurs, and their biggest regret is drafting Josh Primo at number 12 in the draft last year. The regret isn't necessarily taking Primo at all, but a year later the selection still feels like a reach. Nobody expected Primo to go that early on, and if the Spurs were that dead set on drafting him, they definitely could have traded back in the draft to add another asset while still being able to get Primo. And finally, the last team is the Utah Jazz, and their biggest regret is neglecting their perimeter defensive issues. Between Mike Conley declining as a player and both Donovan Mitchell and Jordan Clarkson being subpar defenders out on the perimeter, the Jazz were incredibly porous out there defensively because of that, and Rudy Gobert can only do so much to plug those holes. Now it feels as though one of Gobert or Mitchell is about to be on the move, and the end of an era in in Utah seems to be approaching. And with that being said, that's all I have for you today. Make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment down below what you think the biggest regrets for these teams were this year. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all next time.